Chapter 1. The Iron Serpent. The iron serpent groaned and hissed like a beast of metal and fire, its paddle wheels churning the brackish waters of the Mortis tributary into thick foam the color of rust. Black smoke belched from its twin chimneys, painting the pale sky in streaks of ash. Steam hissed from dozens of riveted pipes, the deck trembling beneath ironclad boots as the crew moved with weary determination under the unrelenting desert sun. Constructed in Altdorf's imperial dockyards and retrofitted in Noon for long-range exploration, the Iron Serpent was a hulking river steamer, more warhammer than vessel. Its steel hull had been scarred by jungle ambushes in the Southlands, its bow still bore the burn marks from a Skane warpstone cannon, and its sides bristled with black powder deck guns. A brass aquila adorned the forecastle like a vulture, corroded and dulled by years of desert grit. Below deck, the stifling belly of the ship clanged with the rhythm of the engine pistons, echoing like the heartbeat of a great iron god. Engineers bustled in sweat-slicked uniforms, faces smeared with soot and grease. Among them was Johann Kreutz, the chief steamwright, whose forearms bore tattooed schematics of the serpent's inner workings, and who barked orders in a voice hoarse from years of coal dust. Above, on the observation deck, Captain Erhard Klausner leaned on the rail, his brass spyglass fixed ahead. His uniform was faded, sun-bleached from months on the river, and his hat hung limp with sweat. A man of few words and fewer expressions, he studied the jagged shapes rising in the distance like broken teeth piercing the golden dunes. Beside him stood Magister Frieda Voss, a scholar from the Altdorf College of Antiquities. Draped in layered desert robes with scrolls and leather-bound journals hanging from her belt, she scribbled furiously in a sand-dusted tome. Her sharp eyes glittered behind soot-stained lenses, alight with the fever of discovery. "Ruins," she breathed. "Nehekhara, I wager. Not on any of our maps." "Then we anchor," Klausner muttered. "Prepare an expedition team." At the rear of the ship, slouched against a coil of rope, a man in crimson leather armor lit a cigarillo with a silver striker. He said nothing, only exhaled a plume of smoke that mingled with the engine's exhaust. His name was Lucio Varnetti, a Tilean mercenary with a coin purse always full and a past always vague. His dark eyes studied the horizon with the indifference of someone who'd seen worse than ancient cities. As the Iron Serpent drifted to a halt, its paddle wheels slowing with a screech of metal, the waters beneath grew shallow, disturbed. Bloated fish carcasses bobbed to the surface, their eyes white, their flesh eaten through by something unseen. The water stank, thick with decay. Ropes were cast, the anchor dropped with a thunderous splash, the crew fanned out with practiced urgency, tying off crates, lowering the gangplank, readying rifles and lanterns. By midday, the first expedition team disembarked. Captain Klausner, Master Voss, Varnetti, and 6 armed soldiers clad in desert leathers and scale mail, sabers and repeater pistols glinting under the cruel sun. Johann stayed aboard to oversee the ship's maintenance, muttering about sand clogging the condenser pipes. The city before them loomed like a corpse half buried in sand. Its walls had crumbled under the weight of centuries, with wind-scoured stone sphinxes lying shattered in dunes. Obelisks jutted from the ground at odd angles, blackened by lightning or worse. The air was dry as bone, but thick with the scent of old incense and something fouler, fetid, lingering just beneath. They passed under a broken gate whose hieroglyphs had been partially eroded, twisting jackal-headed figures and sundists now obscured by claw marks. "This place is older than Bel Aliad," Voss murmured, crouching to inspect a fallen statue. "There's no record of it, nothing in the chronicles of Lahmia, Mahrak, or Zandri." The soldiers said nothing, only tightened their grips on their weapons. They moved deeper into the city. Sand had crept into every crevice, pouring through windows like a tide of gold. Dead palms withered in courtyards, and bones, not animal but human, peeked from collapsed doorways and sunken tombs. Some wore rusted armor. Others had their skulls caved in or limbs twisted grotesquely. One soldier gagged as he lifted a tattered standard from a skeletal grip. The cloth disintegrated in his hands. Varnady watched silently, eyes narrowed. "Keep moving," Klausner ordered. They found what remained of a temple, its stone steps buried beneath sand, but the doorway still intact. Strange symbols marked its arch. Voss gasped and began scribbling notes, then paused as she noticed something gleaming at the foot of a plinth inside. Nestled in a pile of dry sand and brittle bones was a golden scarab, no bigger than a man's fist, its inlaid ruby eyes catching the light like burning coals. Voss knelt and gently plucked it from the dust. A sudden gust swept through the ruined chamber, hot, dry, and sharp as razors. It howled like a scream muffled by centuries. A soldier stepped back, raising his pistol instinctively. "Magister, put that down." Voss stood, transfixed by the relic. This is a key, a tomb marker, a sign of sovereignty. I must study. The earth beneath them trembled. Not a quake, not entirely, a deep, pulsing thud, as though something vast and ancient had shifted far below. Far out on the horizon, the river glistened for a moment, then began to recede. Not evaporate, retreat. The tributary that had carried the iron serpent for weeks began to vanish, its waters drawn away unnaturally fast, as if something massive had begun drinking from the land itself. "Back to the ship," Klausner ordered immediately. But the damage had begun. In the sand behind them, the faint imprint of a skeletal hand reached up, grasping blindly before vanishing beneath the surface once more. Ekra Schiff, unseen, unheard, but awakened. Chapter 2. City of Dust. The sun hung like a brand in the sky, scorching everything beneath it. The ruined city sprawled ahead, half consumed by the desert that clawed at its edges like a living thing. What had once been towering pyramids and stately plazas was now a shattered memory, reduced to jagged walls, buried spires, and wind-scoured ruins. Every gust of wind kicked up a haze of powdered bone and grit, making the air itself feel cursed. Captain Klausner led the way through the fractured main avenue, flanked by 8 soldiers in a defensive diamond formation. Their boots crunched over cracked paving stones and scattered fragments of obsidian statues. Behind them, Magister Frida Voss traced her fingers along the etched walls of the buildings, eyes wide with academic hunger. She murmured to herself, scribbling in a battered journal strapped to her forearm. Lucio Vanetti, the Tilean, stalked at the rear, his eyes scanning the shadows, hand never far from the curved sword at his side. He said nothing, but his fingers twitched every time they passed a doorway too dark to see into. The city was deathly silent. Each building was a mausoleum of its own, windows hollow, doorways sunken. Long-dead tapestries fluttered like flayed skin on what remained of their poles. Carvings and murals stretched across walls, depictions of kings in gold headdresses, priests burning offerings, armies marching beneath a bleeding sun. But time and wind had eroded their faces until they were blurred grotesqueries. Then came the smell, rot and incense. The perfume of death and something more ancient, not decay, but preservation, as if the city had been embalmed along with its rulers. "Here," Frida called from one of the side buildings. "This was a temple. See the scarabs on the lintel, the sun disk above. This is Nehekhara, no doubt." 2 soldiers prized the doors open with steel crowbars, the rusted hinges screeching in protest. A rush of stale air poured out, dense and dry, heavy with the weight of centuries. Inside, shadows clung to the corners, thick with the dust of ages. Columns lined the main chamber, cracked and pitted, some broken in half. A collapsed statue of a jackal-headed god lay on its side, eyes staring blankly at the ruined ceiling. The floor was a mosaic of shattered tiles, the image long since lost. But enough remained to show a river, a golden boat, and a man being weighed by feather and scale. Frida moved like a woman possessed, sweeping sand from the floor with her hands, mumbling ancient phrases. Her fingers traced the glyphs on the far wall, translating on instinct. Here lies Rakh-an-Tep, lord of the dawn, favored of Pitra, bearer of the sun key. She turned, breath-catching. This is his city, it must be. Klausner nodded, indifferent. If there's gold to be had, I don't care what his name was. They descended deeper. Beneath the temple, hidden behind a collapsed wall and layers of debris, they uncovered a narrow stairwell choked with sand. It led to a crypt, the air growing colder with every step. The soldiers lit lanterns, the flickering flames casting mad shadows along the walls, which were lined with murals of a great army marching beneath banners of skulls and sunbursts. At the end of the corridor was a stone door, covered in glyphs and inlaid with lapis lazuli. Frida whispered, "A tomb." "Open it," Klausner ordered. With crowbars and brute force the soldiers pushed. The door gave slowly, grinding like two continents colliding. A sudden gust of air burst out, sharp and sour, carrying the smell of desiccation. Inside was a long chamber, and at its center, a stone bier flanked by two giant statues of kneeling warriors, each gripping obsidian blades. Atop the bier lay a sarcophagus. Not wooden, not stone. Or rather, gold-plated, its surface engraved with divine script, curse symbols, and snarling faces. Upon its chest rested a gleaming scarab brooch, its body a smooth curve of pure gold, legs carved from onyx, and eyes twin rubies that seemed to glow with their own internal fire. No one spoke, not even Frida. Then Klausner stepped forward and reached for it. "Don't," Vernetti said, voice low. Klausner ignored him. His gloved fingers closed around the scarab. The air turned cold, instantly. Not wind, but absence, like a void had opened in the tomb. The ruby eyes of the scarab flared. For the briefest moment, a scream echoed through the chamber, not sound but something in their minds. A shriek of rage and sorrow that tore through the skull like a spike. The scarab snapped in Klausner's hand. It shattered, not like metal but like glass, slicing into his palm. He yelped, blood splattering across the bier. The droplets hissed where they landed. The statues moved. Not a full shift, just the slightest twitch, enough for Vernetti to draw steel. "We need to leave, now." As they turned to flee, the tomb itself groaned. A low tremor shook the walls, dust cascading like rain. The murals flickered, as if trying to pull free from the walls themselves. They reached the surface, breathless and pale, the soldiers gripping their weapons as though the stone beneath might rise up against them. And then they saw it. The river. Where once the Mahdi's tributary had flowed, the waters now fled, drawn back into the desert like veins drained of blood. The surface boiled with movement, fish spasming, flailing as they suffocated in seconds. The trees along the banks curled and withered before their eyes, leaves falling like blackened ash. The iron serpent sat awkwardly on the exposed riverbed, its hull groaning in protest. Engineers scrambled to adjust ballast and anchor lines, shouting over one another in panic. The world shivered again, this time stronger. The earth quaked with a hollow pulse. From the direction of the temple, sand began to sink, as if something beneath was drawing it inward. A low, terrible hum filled the air, the sound of a voice not heard in millennia, speaking from a throat no longer of flesh. The crew stood frozen. Lucio Vernetti whispered one word, curses, and in the city of dust, the dead began to remember. Chapter 3. The river runs dry. Night fell over the ruins like a death shroud, smothering the last vestiges of heat and light beneath a blanket of heavy darkness. The stars above were sharp and cold, hung motionless in a sky so black it seemed to press down like the weight of the desert itself. The only sounds were the occasional hiss of cooling metal from the iron serpent's engine and the slow, whispering rustle of sand shifting in the wind. The crew had returned from the tomb, shaken and wide-eyed, speaking in clipped tones, avoiding the subject of the scarab and the blood-slicked beer. Captain Klausner had his hand bound in stained gauze, the flesh beneath burning and twitching with an itch that hadn't stopped since he touched the relic. He kept silent, staring out over the river, saying nothing of the way his skin had gone cold, or how the whispering had begun just behind his ears when the sun dipped below the dunes. By dawn, the whispering stopped, and so did the river. When the first engine tech Higo, a gangly youth with oil-stained teeth, stumbled up to the deck for his morning shift, he froze mid-yawn. His mouth hung open, the coal bucket falling from his hands with a clang. "Captain," he called, voice cracking. Klausner emerged moments later, pulling on his boots, gun belt slung across his back. Then he saw it. Where there had been water, there was now nothing, not even mud. The riverbed stretched out like a cracked wound through the desert, deep fissures running through its center like veins gone dry. Fish skeletons lay curled and brittle in the dust, their scales curled upward like sunburnt leaves. The jungle creepers and swamp vines that had once clung to the shoreline now drooped and withered, curling in on themselves as if in pain. The iron serpent rested at an awkward angle on its hull, one paddle wheel partially sunken in cracked silt, the other hanging limp in the dry air. The smell was worse, not just the reek of rot, but something unnatural. Old blood, dust and resin, like a tomb freshly broken open. A bell rang sharply from the crow's nest. "Captain, you best see this." Klausner climbed to the observation deck, jaw clenched. The lookout pointed out toward the southern dunes. There, just at the edge of visibility, the sand was collapsing, not into a sinkhole, but folding, like a curtain being drawn downward into a pit. "Get the gear offloaded," Klausner snapped. "We're stranded. Start rationing water. Salvage anything that can move on land." Orders spread through the crew like wildfire. Crates were hauled off the ship, tarpaulins rigged into makeshift tents, the smaller collapsible skiffs disassembled and checked for damage. The heat intensified quickly. By noon the sun had turned cruel and men were collapsing under its gaze. And then came the prince. "Over here!" a soldier shouted, crouching near the edge of the dried river. The sand was disturbed. Tracks, deep, sharp, unnatural, pressed into the dust. Clawed impressions, as if left by something walking on bone-spurred limbs. Some looked like bare feet with splayed toes, others like the talons of vultures. But no man walked like that. They were fresh. "Could be jackals," someone offered weakly. "No jackal walks upright," Lucio Vernetti said from behind, his voice hard as sun-baked clay. He knelt, tracing the edge of a print with his finger. "And no jackal has claws like these." Klausner came closer, inspecting the pattern. "How many?" "Too many," Vernetti answered, "but not in a rush. They weren't hunting yet." That single word, "yet," hung in the air like a funeral bell. That night, sentries were doubled. They built fires in a perimeter around the serpent, but the flames only seemed to shrink against the vast blackness of the dunes. Every sound beyond the firelight twisted into something sinister. The whimper of the wind became whispers. The shifting sands sounded like footsteps. The bones of dead fish cracked underfoot like brittle knuckles. At midnight, a scream tore through the camp. One of the engineers, a man named Kell, had gone to piss behind a dune and never returned. They found him minutes later, half buried in sand. His throat had been torn out, not cut, not bitten. Torn, the flesh peeled like paper, ribs showing beneath the skin, eyes wide and still wet with terror. His arms were raised, caught in a frozen flinch. He had tried to fight. His fingers were broken from clawing at something, and his boots were gone. Just gone. Tracks led away from the corpse. The same bone talon prints, now stained with blood. They vanished into the dunes like ghosts. "No gunfire," Klausner muttered. He never screamed until it was too late. "There was no sound," whispered one of the guards, pale and shaking. "I was on watch. I didn't hear anything." Frida Voss stood at the edge of the corpse, hand over her mouth. Her eyes didn't leave the torn flesh. "I told you," she murmured, almost to herself. "The scarab was a seal. We broke it." "Seal of what?" Klausner asked, already knowing the answer. She didn't respond. That night, no one slept. Some stayed huddled near the boilers, pressing their backs to the warm metal. Others held rifles so tightly their knuckles turned white. Vernady never sat. He stood watch by the central fire, sword drawn, eyes never blinking. Beneath them, in the hollow earth, the dead stirred. Not skeletons risen from grave pits. No, these were soldiers, entombed in obsidian armor, their bones gilded with gold and soot, eyes replaced with amber, teeth painted with sacred ink. They moved with purpose, with memory, ancient military formations reforming beneath the sand, like fossilized commands echoing into eternity. Their king had awakened, and his army would follow. The iron serpent had become a coffin, the desert a battlefield, and the living were now intruders. Chapter 4. Awakening of the Tomb King. Far beneath the cracked dunes and sun-split ruins of the dead city, beyond the reach of wind and time, there lay a tomb cut from black stone, smooth, seamless, and untouched by a single grain of sand. It was not a place of rest, but of vigil, for death in Nehekhara had never been the end. Within the dark heart of that tomb, beneath a domed ceiling etched with gold-lit constellations long forgotten by mortal scholars, lay the sarcophagus of Rakh-an-Tep, high priest, warlord, god-king of the crescent obelisk, forgotten by the world above but not by themselves. The sarcophagus was not humble. It was a monument, 12 feet long, carved from obsidian, veined with necrotic silver, its surface crowded with glyphs that pulsed faintly with buried magic. A depiction of Rakh-an-Tep adorned the lid, arms crossed over a sun disk, his mask impassive, his headdress flaring like a cobra's hood. Below, bound in spells and wards, a body waited, a memory wrapped in bandage and malice. Silence reigned in the chamber, but then came a crack. It echoed like thunder in a cathedral, not from the tomb itself, but from far above. A scarab relic, once placed upon his sacred altar as a sigil of eternal stillness, was broken, desecrated, stolen by unclean hand. Something snapped across the veil. One of the runes on the sarcophagus blinked out, its glow dying like a star swallowed by night. Then another, and another. Chains woven from spells of stasis and silence withered and snapped one by one, breaking not with sound, but with a hiss of unrealized time unraveling. Dust began to swirl in the still air. The black stone floor trembled. A deep, wretched breath pulled in, as if lungs that had not drawn air in 3,000 years were once more reminded of the world. From within the sarcophagus a faint thumping began, slow and arrhythmic. Thump. Until suddenly a violent impact shattered the obsidian lid from within, sending it flying across the chamber to crash against a pillar with a blast of dust and broken magic. A hand emerged, skeletal, mummified, but wrapped in ceremonial wrappings of gold-threaded linen. Its bones were carved with scripture, joints reinforced with alchemical metals, nails sharpened like claws. The hand gripped the edge of the sarcophagus, pulling the rest of its master from the abyss of death. Rakh-an-Tep stood. He was a giant, over 8 feet tall, cloaked in layers of ancient burial garb, stiff and cracked from the dry tomb air. His armor gleamed, gold inlaid with lapis lazuli, bearing the sun mark of Petra and the blackened vulture of Jaff. His face was a lacquered death mask, its surface polished to an inhuman sheen, eyes replaced with burning amber crystals that flickered with internal fire. His chest rose slowly, bandages tightening as if something far greater than lungs now moved within him. He spoke, not with words, but with thought, his voice echoing through the crypt like thunder rolling across a mountain. They all returned. From the dark, the statues surrounding the chamber began to stir. They were not statues. They never had been. Each one cracked, splitting down the middle, shedding their stone shells like chrysalises. Inside were royal guards, long dead, wrapped and armored, still bearing the weapons with which they had fallen. Their skulls clicked as they turned toward their king, eyes glowing faintly like dying coals reigniting. "Who has broken the seal?" the voice thundered through the dust. "Who has dared?" His thoughts reached beyond the chamber, through the tunnels, through the crypts, into the city itself. And the dead heard him, all of them, across catacombs and ossuaries, in forgotten plazas and beneath crumbling temples, bones shuddered. Fleshless jaws gaped open in silent screams. Fingers twitched through soil and silk. Limbs contorted back to unlife with a violent immediacy of a curse revoked. Hundreds, thousands stirred in the darkness. In one catacomb, a line of skeletal soldiers, entombed in formation, rose to their feet as one. Dust sloughed off their armor, weapons held tightly in brittle hands. Archers knocked arrows made of obsidian, tips blackened by ritual. Cavalry, their skeletal steeds reanimated, pawed at the stone floor with scraping hooves. In a deeper tomb, a necrotect, his jaw torn and refastened with bronze, awoke with a grinding snarl. His hands began sculpting unseen shapes in the air, calling forgotten sorceries into form. The army of Rakh-an-Tep was returning. Back in his sanctum, the Tomb King raised his staff, an iron rod topped with a symbol of the burning sun. Visions struck him in waves of the foreign ships stranded on the dry riverbed, of the men with rifles and boots, their tools of iron and coal desecrating sacred ground, of the thief who took the scarab, spilling blood where none should fall. He clenched his jaw, the sound of bone on bone grinding like millstones. "Invaders," he hissed. "Desecrators." He stepped down from the sarcophagus, each footfall echoing with divine finality. "You will be judged, you will be flensed, you will be broken upon the wheel of eternity." With a motion of his hand, the walls of the tomb split open, revealing vast catacombs leading to the surface. Columns of light broke through the cracks in the city above, filtering through the rising dust. The tomb shook. The army marched. The sand above shifted like a storm building from below, the wind no longer natural but driven by the will of the dead. And high above, the iron serpent sat motionless, baking under the desert sun, unaware of the tide of vengeance rising from beneath. The desert had remembered its king, that it would remember his wrath. Chapter 5. Bones in the Sand. Night fell with a breathless stillness, broken only by the low groan of cooling steel and the crackle of flames as the crew huddled close to the dwindling perimeter fires. The iron serpent rested at a tilted angle in the dry riverbed, its massive paddle wheel now a rusting monument to a journey ended. Tents and makeshift barricades surrounded her, stacked crates, rigged canvas, broken deck plating repurposed as shields. Rifles were loaded and reloaded with nervous hands. Shadows danced in the dunes like ghosts caught in the firelight. No one spoke of the tracks. No one dared ask what they belonged to. The soldiers kept their rifles close, eyes darting from dune to dune. Sentinels patrolled in tight arcs, their boots kicking up the fine ashen sand that clung to everything like a sickness. The engineers worked tirelessly, stripping the serpent of anything valuable: water, ammunition, rations, maps. The desert had swallowed the river whole. If salvation was to be found, it would be on foot, westward to the mountains, where, they hoped, an ancient signal tower or fortress might still stand. And then, just past midnight, it began. The first scream came from the northern slope of the camp. A sharp gurgling sound like someone trying to breathe through a slashed throat. Then gunfire, 3 rapid shots, then silence. A moment later, a blood-drenched figure staggered into the firelight. Private Hens, wide-eyed and trembling, his mouth agape, fingers missing, ragged holes torn through his chest and back. He collapsed before anyone could speak. Lucio Varnetti was the first to reach him, flipping the man over as the crew scrambled from their tents, rifles raised. "Who did this?" Klausner growled, weapon drawn. But Varnetti didn't answer. He stood slowly, eyes fixed on the ridgeline. The wind shifted, and with it came the rattle. Bones, dry bones knocking together, like wind chimes made from the dead. It echoed across the sands, faint at first, then growing louder, rhythmic, purposeful. Watching, shadows formed along the crest of the dunes, figures in ancient armor, long decayed and sun-bleached, moving with unnatural coordination. They carried weapons of rusted bronze and blackened obsidian. Their eyes burned with unnatural light, and their mouths hung agape in silent howls. They charged. The camp exploded into chaos. Gunfire ripped into the night, muzzle flashes lighting the scene like a thunderstorm. Bullets tore through bone, shattering rib cages and pulverizing skulls, but still they came. Dozens, scores, some crawling, others running, some dragging ancient standards or golden icons that shimmered in the firelight. An engineer, a young man named Rolf, screamed as skeletal hands tore through the canvas beside him, yanking him backward into the dark. Blood sprayed across the side of the serpent, painting the hull in long streaks as his scream faded into a bubbling gurgle. A soldier fell to one knee, desperately reloading, when a bone javelin pierced through his throat with a wet, meaty crunch. He gagged, clawing at the shaft, blood gushing down his chest, before collapsing in spasms. Another tried to run, only to be pulled down by 3 skeletal warriors, one grabbing his legs, another plunging a curved khopesh into his spine, the third bashed his skull in with a ceremonial mace. The sound was like a melon crushed underfoot. Klausner roared orders. "Form ranks, protect the wounded, hold the line." But the line was already broken. Magister Voss crouched behind an overturned crate, incanting through gritted teeth as she fired a runed pistol into the horde. Each shot disintegrated its target in a blast of blue flame, but for every one she felled, 2 more replaced it. Lucio Varnetti fought like a man possessed, his curved Tilean saber singing through the air, severing arms, splitting skulls. One skeleton lunged with a spear, but Varnetti sidestepped and drove his blade through its eye socket, wrenching it free in a shower of powder and shards. Then came the Royal Guard, towering figures clad in lamella gold-plated armor, their skulls masked in snarling visages of jackals and cobras. Their weapons were ritualistic and cruel, massive 2-handed glaives and flanged maces designed to maim rather than kill. They moved with precision, tearing through the outer ring of defenders like wheat under the scythe. The blast of flame erupted from the Serpent's deck as Johann Kreutz, the engineer, unleashed the last reserves of the flamethrower built for jungle warfare. The gout of fire caught 3 of the guards in its fury, but as the flames faded, one of them, still burning, marched through the blaze, its eye sockets glowing brighter with each step. It swung its weapon. The wet crash of head disappeared in a wet mist of bone and brains. Klausner's voice bellowed through the mayhem. "We can't hold. Fall back. Leave the Serpent west to the mountains." The crew scrambled to obey. Frida Voss retrieved her satchel and the torn pages of her notes, clutching the book of Nehekharan glyphs like a holy relic. "We can't leave it!" she screamed, more to herself than anyone. "It's not just a curse. He's coming." Lucio grabbed her by the collar and shoved her forward. "You want to die screaming in the sand? Move!" They ran. Through fire and blood, over the shattered barricades, past the broken bodies of friends and comrades. The survivors, barely 24, raced into the night, some barefoot, others bleeding, most with nothing but what they could carry. Behind them, the iron Serpent finally gave up its ghost. The deck erupted in fire as the powder stores ignited, sending a shockwave through the camp. The explosion lit the dunes like daylight for an instant, revealing the swarm of undead still advancing, hundreds now, maybe more. Their shadows flickered in the blast like a tide of insects. And at their center, far in the distance, stood a figure taller than any man, proud in gold, cloaked in darkness. Watching, waiting. Rakh-an-Tep. The march west had begun. Though for how many would it end? Chapter 6. March of the Doomed. The desert was a sea of gold and white and death. Each dune they crossed was a mountain of glassy sand, steep and treacherous, burning beneath their boots like a forge floor. The sun, merciless, monstrous, hung like a crucible in the sky, warping the air into twisted rivers of heat. It was not a sky meant for men, not any more. This was a realm of the dead, and they were trespassers walking on borrowed time. The survivors, what was left of them, numbered 19. Their eyes were rimmed with red, crusted from dust and sweat, lips cracked open like old parchment, throats dry as grave ash. Every step forward drew a curse, a stumble, or a prayer. A few walked barefoot, their souls blistered and bleeding. They had fled with only what they could carry, canteens half-filled, packs hastily snatched, bandages already bloodied. Every direction looked the same, dunes rolling into oblivion, shimmering heat waves painting the horizon with promises of things that were never there. At the front of the march, Captain Klausner walked with shoulders set like stone, his sun-scorched face unreadable. One arm was bandaged tightly, blood seeping through the gauze where something inside him festered. Each hour, the red spot grew a little larger. He said nothing about it. Magister Voss lagged behind, hunched beneath the weight of her satchel and its contents, her journals, the map, and the few salvaged scrolls of Nehekhara text. She muttered to herself constantly, trying to piece together the meaning behind the relic they had stolen. Her skin blistered from the sun, her robes ragged, her voice dry and broken. Her voice dry and broken. Near her walked Lucio Vernetti, silent, watchful, and untrusting. He held his curved blade low at his side, his other hand often tucked beneath his chest plate where the scarab shard pulsed faintly in a hidden pouch. No one knew he had kept a piece of it. And he did not intend to tell them. The scarab whispered to him now, not in words, but in dreams. Visions of towers rising from the sand, of a burning sun eclipsed by black wings, of a voice like thunder calling him child of thieves. Above them, circling high in the glare of the sun, the vulture watched. Its wings were tattered but immense, its feathers like burnt parchment, brittle and torn, Where eyes should have been, there were only hollow sockets, glimmering with sickly green flame. Bone gleamed through missing patches of flesh, and around its neck hung a collar of gold, marked with the cartouche of Rakh-an-Tep. It wheeled lazily through the sky, never needing to flap, drifting on the currents of death and heat. Its gaze did not falter. It was not alone. By the third day, morale cracked. Tempers flared, trust wore thin, words turned to shouts, shouts turned to blows. A gunshot rang out just before sunset. A soldier named Kurtz, paranoid, sun-maddened, had accused one of the engineers of hoarding water. He'd drawn his pistol and fired. The bullet missed, but the message did not. Klausner tackled him to the ground, fists flying. The others held back, too shocked or exhausted to intervene. But then Kurtz drew a knife. Klausner's hand closed around it before it struck, and forced it backward, into Kurtz's own eye. The blade sank with a wet pop, and Kurtz howled. The howl didn't last long. Klausner twisted the blade. Kurtz went limp. The captain sat in the sand, chest heaving, covered in sweat and gore. He did not look up. He only muttered, "We are not dying for thieves." No one asked what he meant. That night, the mirages came. They rose from the sands like dreams given form, cities of glass, shining towers, cool rivers, forests with golden leaves. One man, delirious with thirst, broke from the group and sprinted toward an oasis that melted as he reached it. He fell, screaming, as his body slid into a dune that was not solid, sinking like he had stepped into quicksand. Only his hands remained visible before the desert swallowed him whole. Another claimed he saw his dead son waving at him from atop a dune. He followed the vision. They never saw him again. Frida screamed in her sleep, waking from nightmares of sand filling her mouth, her lungs. She claimed the scarab had not been a key but a lock. She whispered that they had opened a door that should never have existed. Lucia watched her from the shadows. His hand kept touching the pouch. The shard inside was warm now, hot, even. And at night, when the wind howled across the dunes, it sang to him promises of command, of legacy, of power over death itself. But he had not yet listened. On the fourth morning, they found bones in the sand, but not human. These were horses or something once like them, riders still mounted, their armor twisted into alien shapes, their lances buried in the sand, as if they had fallen in combat long ago. But the bones were clean, too clean. No scavengers dared touch them. Klausner ordered the march to quicken. That evening, as they crested a high dune, they looked westward and saw at last the faint outline of mountains. The peaks shimmered like a hallucination, but they were real. Frida wept. A few laughed through cracked lips. One man collapsed with relief, his body finally failing. But above them the vulture circled once more. Then it turned, dipped a wing, and flew back east. The army had their trail, and Rakh-an-Tep would follow. Chapter 7. The Bone Caravan. The sun dipped behind the ragged hills of the western horizon, leaving behind a bruised sky of ochre and violet. Shadows stretched across the dunes, like the fingers of a corpse, long and grasping, as the survivors crested a slope and stared down into the skeleton of civilization. There, half buried in the sand, lay the ruins of a once grand caravanserai. Stone walls rose at jagged angles from the desert, their corners softened by centuries of wind-blasted grit. What had once been a bustling sanctuary for traders, pilgrims, and crusaders was now a shattered monument to failure and dust. The massive archways had collapsed inward, and the central courtyard was filled with drifts of fine sand that had swallowed carts, bones, and banners. A broken statue stood guard over the gate, its face eroded smooth by time, arms outstretched, as if trying to hold back the desert's encroaching tide. Upon the lintel, barely legible beneath a thick crust of grime and sand, was an inscription in chipped Bretonnian. Sanctum solus. Let none perish. Beneath the eyes of the lady. They passed beneath it in silence. Inside, the survivors made camp amidst crumbling colonnades and shattered fountain basins. The wind howled through the high arches like a choir of ghosts, and the air was choked with the scent of old bones and rust. Captain Klausner limped to a corner alcove, clutching his arm, the bandage now soaked through with blackened blood. Veins around the wound had turned a sickly greenish hue, and his skin was cold despite the heat. He sat down heavily and said nothing as Lucio Varnetti lit a small fire with flint and scrap parchment. Magister Voss explored the ruins with a flickering lantern, driven by a desperate hunger for context. Her eyes gleamed feverishly as she uncovered the remains of old journals buried beneath a collapsed shelf in what had once been a scribe's room. She opened the first with trembling fingers. The parchment flaked away at the corners, but the ink, protected by dry air and divine desperation, remained legible. The author was a Bretonnian knight, a crusader who had passed this way nearly 3 centuries earlier, during a doomed attempt to reach the coast of Nehekhara. "We are pursued by phantoms," one entry read. "At night, we hear hoofbeats on the dunes, but there is nothing to see. Our water dwindles. Our brothers vanish without trace. Sir Alaric claims the sands whisper to him. He no longer sleeps." Another page. "They came again tonight. Not men, not beasts. Cavalry of bone and gold, spears like lightning, hooves without sound. May the lady grant us death before they return." Frida closed the journal slowly. Her hands shook. "We should not stay here," she whispered. No one disagreed, but none of them had the strength to keep moving. They set a perimeter. Stacked sandbags and broken masonry, posted guards with rifles and axes. They dragged ancient furniture from the ruins to form barricades and set traps using broken lantern glass and twisted nails. A few of the crew began to laugh, not from humor, but madness, as if the idea of defending a graveyard from the dead was too absurd to be real. As the sun vanished, the temperature plummeted. Stars wheeled overhead, the fires burned low. Then came the hooves. Soft at first, a rhythmic, distant thudding like thunder buried in cotton. The guards stood to attention, rifles trembling in their hands. Then the sound split, 2, then 4, then dozens. Coming fast. Klausner rose with a groan, drawing his saber. "Positions! No shots until you see them." They didn't have to wait long. The first of the riders crested the dunes in silence. Bone gleamed beneath tattered barding, eyes burning like green lanterns in hollow skulls. The cavalry came in ranks, perfectly spaced, wielding ancient spears and swords etched with Nehekharan script. Their mounts, horses long dead, their hides leather-stretched over exposed ribs, snorted and reared without making a sound. Then they charged. The ground shook as 24 skeletal riders thundered toward the camp, kicking up sand and grit in a rising cloud of dust and death. "Open fire," Klausner roared. The night was torn apart by gunfire. Repeater rifles lit the courtyard with muzzle flash, cutting down the first wave. Bones shattered under the barrage, skulls exploded, rib cages disintegrated, and 2 horses went down in a tangle of legs and dust. But the cavalry kept coming. One rider leapt over the barricade entirely, landing amidst the crew with a crash. Its spear impaled a screaming soldier through the abdomen, lifting him into the air like a trophy, before the skeleton yanked it free and turned on the next. Lucio lunged, blade flashing. He decapitated the mount in a single sweep, then plunged his dagger into the rider's eye socket, shattering the skull with a crunch. it fell into ash and splintered gold. To the east wall, a rider crashed through a crumbled arch and skewered 2 defenders with one thrust, dragging their bodies across the sand. Blood sprayed across the walls in streaks, painting old Bretonnian graffiti with fresh death. Klausner went down in a heap after taking a blade to the leg, but fired his pistol upward into the chest cavity of a rider, pinning him. The shot burst through the spine, and the corpse collapsed on top of him with a sound like dry firewood snapping. More poured in. Frida raised her pistol and fired blindly, crying out in despair and fury. One rider took a shot to the face and collapsed, but another knocked her to the ground. Just before the spear plunged into her throat, Varnetti tackled it, sending both crashing into a broken pillar. The fight devolved into brutality. Gunpowder spent, steel clanged against bone, screams pierced the wind. One man swung a broken shovel and caved in a rider's skull with such force that shards of bone embedded into his own chest. Another was dragged screaming from the edge of the camp, his legs kicking, his screams fading into the dark. And just as suddenly, it stopped. The lost rider collapsed with a hiss of evaporating spirit, its bones crumbling to dust. Only the wind remained. 15 survivors, and more night won barely. But they all knew this was no victory, only delay. From the west, the mountains loomed like jagged tombstones, and from the east, the endless march of the dead continued. Chapter 8. The Mirage Fortress. They stumbled forward beneath the bleating sky, the survivors little more than walking husks now, lips split, skin burned and peeling, bones grinding under the weight of exhaustion and despair. Each footfall sunk into the scorching sand like it might be the last, leaving behind faint red imprints where blood had soaked through boots and bandages. 15. That was all that remained. They had buried 3 at the caravanserai before dawn, those whose bodies had not been torn apart. Shallow graves, unmarked, forgotten already. There was no time for mourning, no time for words, only motion. The dunes began to shift again around noon, rolling like waves beneath the sun, distorting the horizon with heat haze and smoke. The wind carried with it a keening sound, distant at first like someone humming through dry teeth. Klausner insisted it was nothing. Others whispered it was the Tomb King's voice. Frida Voss trudged near the front, half mad with sun and fever, her fingers blackened by ink and rot. The pages of her journal flapped in the wind, scratched with rambling glyphs and prayer fragments. Her eyes, sunken, wild, locked on to the far distance. "There," she croaked. "There. My Sigmar's breath, do you see it?" The crew lifted their heads. Beyond the shimmering dunes, nestled between the golden valleys and the dying sky, rose a dark shape. Towers, walls, faint but undeniably real. A fortress. Pale flags fluttered, bastions of stone glimmered with the promise of sanctuary. A miracle in the desert. They rushed forward, tripping, scrambling, weeping openly. It was the fortress of the Oasis, a legend of the Crusades said to have been razed by Sigmarite zealots during the early incursions into Nehekhara. A bastion that stood against darkness for a century, its walls fed by an underground spring, defended by knights who never yielded. It was salvation. It was hope. But hope in Nehekhara is always a lie. The closer they came, the more it twisted. The towers flickered, stone to sand to smoke. The walls lost shape, melting and shifting with every step. One man, too desperate to believe otherwise, sprinted ahead with what little strength he had, screaming, "We're saved!" They watched as he ran up the slope of the final dune, reached out, completely vanished. No scream, no collapse, no fall, just gone. Frida dropped to her knees, the strength fleeing her body in a single gust. "It's not real," she whispered. "It's not. It's a mirage. It was never real. The others stared as the fortress dissolved into haze, nothing but a curve of sunlit sand in its place. The same wind blew across it, as if mocking their hope. Klausner swore bitterly and stumbled back, clutching his infected arm. The wound had begun to stink, and his skin now wept dark ichor. One of the soldiers offered to cauterize it. He refused. Deep down he knew it didn't matter anymore. It was Varnetti who broke the silence. "You were all fools to follow me this far," he muttered, standing apart, hand on the hilt of his saber. Frida looked up, brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Lucio pulled something from his chest pouch, something wrapped tightly in cloth. As he unwrapped it, the group recoiled. Within was a fragment of the Scarab relic, still intact despite the damage. It pulsed with a dull golden glow, the ruby eye at its center now cracked and darkened like a blood clot. "You kept it," Klausner snarled. "You damn bastard, we're dying because of that thing." Lucio's blade was drawn in a flash. "No," he said coldly. "You're dying because you didn't know what you were dealing with." They stared. Lucio sheathed the blade slowly and sighed. "My name isn't Varnetti, not really. I'm not just a mercenary. I was born in Tobaro, yes, but I was trained in the libraries beneath the shimmering vault. I've studied Nehekhara magic for decades. I know what this relic is, what it means." Frida stood, unsteady, clutching her journal like a shield. "You lied to us this whole time?" "I protected you," he said, "because if I'd told you the truth, you'd have killed me on the river, and then you'd all be dead already." He stepped forward and knelt, placing the fragment on a flat stone. Its glow grew brighter, reacting to something in the air, perhaps proximity to the Tomb King's will. "This scarab," Lucio said, "was part of a binding spell, a seal designed to keep Rakh-an-Tep and his legion dormant. When we took it, we didn't just wake him. We opened the gate between the living and the dead. But there's still a chance." He looked up, meeting Frida's eyes. "If I can reach the crown obelisk, his heart tomb, I might be able to rebind him, seal him back inside the sands." "Might?" Klausner rasped. "It's suicide," one soldier muttered. Lucio's mouth curled into a grim smile. "It's better than waiting to be torn apart in our sleep." A silence followed. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Finally Frida spoke. "Where is the obelisk?" Lucio turned eastward, back toward the city they had fled, back toward the bones, the fires, the vengeance rising with each step of the Tomb King's army. We passed it. On the second night after the river dried, you all thought it was just another ruin, but it wasn't. That's where his soul waits, where he draws his power. Klausner, shaking and pale, spat blood into the sand. "So we go back? March into his kingdom?" Lucio stood, scarab fragment in hand, and looked out over the sand as the sun began to die again behind the dunes. "If we don't, none of us leave this desert alive." The others watched him, uncertain, exhausted, and broken. But deep down they knew he was right. The march west was over. Now the true descent began. Chapter 9. The final stand at the obelisk. The wind howled like a chorus of damned souls as the survivors ascended the final dune. There, in the basin below, half buried in sand and shadow, stood the crown obelisk, a monument carved from blackened marble and veined with meteoric silver, its once pristine surface now fractured by centuries of neglect. The top had been shattered, and jagged runes crackled with faint, flickering light, the last remnants of holy energy clinging to the stone like fading breath. The air around it was thick, vibrating with ancient power. The sand refused to settle within a dozen paces of it, whipped endlessly into spirals, as if the desert itself feared to touch it. Bones littered its base, some weathered and broken, others fresh and gleaming white. A place of death and defiance. Sanctuary, of a kind. Lucio Varnetti stood motionless, the scarab fragment in hand, his face gaunt and marked with grime and blood. The relic pulsed in his palm, glowing brighter the closer they came to the obelisk. His fingers curled around it with reverence and dread. "We make our stand here," he said. The others, 9 left now, nodded in silence. There were no cheers, no hopeful speeches. Just the sound of rifles being loaded, blades being sharpened, and prayers muttered through cracked lips. Captain Klausner could barely stand, the infection in his arm having spread up his chest. He leaned on a broken halberd for support, sweat pouring from his brow, eyes sunken and dull. Yet still he gave orders, his voice like gravel in the wind. "Fortify the northern slope. Use the stones from that broken wall. Put the rifles there. Booby-trap the southern path with powder, 1 spark if they breach." They worked with grim efficiency. A barricade of rubble and shattered masonry was erected. Sandbags, corpses, broken shields, anything they could use to slow the tide. The air grew colder with every passing minute, the light dimming, as though the sun itself had begun to retreat in fear. Then came the silence, a heavy, suffocating quiet that made their hearts pound all the louder. And then horns, a low, ululating sound, like beasts bellowing through hollow bone. From the dunes emerged the first wave. The army of Rakh-an-Tep, 1,000 strong, perhaps more. Skeletons clad in tarnished bronze and blackened gold, wielding weapons older than empires. Archers with eyes like burning coals. Horsemen mounted on nightmarish beasts of bone and sinew. Chariots drawn by mummified animals, their wheels etched with blood runes. And at the center of the host, flanked by towering necrotics and guarded by 2 colossal ushabti carved from obsidian, rode Rakh-an-Tep himself. He stood atop a litter held aloft by 6 skeletal bearers, cloaked in ancient silks that defied the wind. His mask, ornate, sun-shaped, rimmed with gold and lapis, hid a face long since rotted to dust. His scepter pulsed with necrotic energy, and every step forward brought the sound of a funeral drum from beneath the sands. The survivors held their breath. Then Klausner raised his saber. Now, the cliffs erupted. Black powder charges buried in the sand ignited, sending fire and shrapnel into the advancing front. Bones shattered, dust and ash filled the air. From behind the barricade, rifles thundered, repeating fire cracking like lightning. Undead fell in droves, but more replaced them instantly. The swarm surged forward, arrows raining from above like iron hail. One defender took a shaft through the throat, collapsing backward with a choking gurgle. Another screamed as a javelin split his side and pinned him to the obelisk's base. Frida Voss, her hands blistered and trembling, fired her pistol until the barrel was too hot to hold. Then she threw it aside and raised a broken spear like a priestess in a final rite. They fought tooth and nail, every inch of ground soaked in blood and ichor. Lucio stood behind the obelisk, the scarab fragment now glowing so brightly it cast his shadow in every direction. He held a blade in his other hand, not his Tilean saber, but one taken from the tomb, etched with glyphs that seared the eyes. He chanted. The words were in Nehekhara, spoken with perfect fluency. Frida, pinned behind the barricade, turned in horror. "That's not a prayer. That's a summoning." "It's a binding," Lucio snapped. "I know what I'm doing." As he spoke, the relic lifted into the air, spinning slowly above the obelisk, pulling in the energy from the holy site, from the air, from the earth itself. The sand around him froze, hovering in midair, suspended in time. The undead began to falter. Some collapsed mid-run. Others stopped entirely, dropping weapons, clawing at their skulls as if in pain. Even the Ushabti froze, their obsidian bodies cracking with strain. Rakh-an-Tep raised his scepter and screamed, a mental shriek that shattered the stillness. Lucio staggered. Blood ran from his nose and ears. His eyes rolled back, but still he chanted, louder now, forcing the words past teeth clenched in agony. Rakh-an-Tep stepped down from his litter. He walked forward, slowly, inexorably, parting the tide of his legion with sheer will. Lucio screamed the final phrase and thrust the blade into the ground at the obelisk's base. The scarab shattered. The light exploded outward, a detonation of radiant force, searing like sunlight on parchment. Everything went white, then silence. When the light faded, Rakh-an-Tep stood still. A single crack appeared in his golden mask. Then another, and then, with a sigh like wind through dead reeds, his body crumbled. Armor, bones, soul, all torn apart and scattered to the wind. His army fell with him. One by one, the undead collapsed, weapons slipping from lifeless fingers, bones turning to dust before they hit the ground. The chariots disintegrated, the banners caught fire, the war drums stopped. And all was still. Lucio fell to his knees, coughing blood. His skin blistered, veins blackened. His fingers had fused to the hilt of the blade, the magic having burned through his flesh and soul alike. Frida reached him, pulling him up as he gasped. "Did it work?" she whispered. Lucio nodded once, then died. She laid him down beside the obelisk, his face calm, for the first time since the river ran dry. Only 5 remained. They stood beneath the fractured monument, surrounded by silence and sand, broken by the storm, but not taken. And in the wind there were no more drums. Chapter 10. Ash and Echoes. The desert was quiet again. Not the stillness of calm, but the silence that follows cataclysm. The kind of hush that weighs heavily on the chest, like the world itself is mourning. The dunes had shifted back into place, the air no longer crackling with ancient power. Only the wind remained, whispering through the ravaged basin, tugging gently at broken bones and burnt banners. It was dawn. A pale, weak light spilled across the sand, touching the top of the shattered crown obelisk, painting the blood-stained rubble in soft gold. Dust shimmered in the cold morning air, rising like spirits ascending into the heavens. There were only 5 survivors. They sat or lay amid the ruin, too weak to speak, too exhausted to cry. Magister Frida Voss knelt by Lucio's body, still wrapped in his tattered cloak, his face pale but peaceful. She had washed the blood from his mouth with the last of her water. In her lap, the remnants of her journal sat soaked with blood and desert moisture, the ink blurred, the pages warped. Klausner lay propped against a fallen column, half conscious, his arm black to the shoulder. The infection had slowed since the banishment of the Tomb King, but it would not be reversed. He knew it. He didn't ask for help. He simply stared at the sky and whispered broken prayers to Sigmar between fits of coughing. The others, 2 soldiers and an engineer, sat in silence, their weapons across their laps, staring blankly at the dunes. One sobbed softly into his hands. Another picked at a wound that would not heal. The last clutched a medallion of more and muttered a list of names. Some likely dead, some perhaps imaginary. None spoke of what had happened. None dared to. From the east, the wind began to rise. A great, slow push of air moved across the sands, shifting the dunes back into place. It moved like a beast at rest, smoothing away the signs of war. Bones vanished beneath the rolling earth. Shattered relics disappeared into the grit. The broken banners of Rakh-an-Tep's army, sun-faded and blood-crusted, were pulled down by unseen hands. Even the ashes of the dead began to blend into the soil. The ruined city in the distance, barely visible, was slowly devoured by the sands once more. Tower by tower, wall by wall, it faded into the golden tide. The wind made no sound as it passed over its grave, save for a single sigh, like breath escaping a sealed tomb. Yet beneath the surface, something remained. Buried where the obelisk's shadow had once fallen, 1/2 meter below the sand, a single shard of the scarab relic pulsed faintly. Its ruby eye, cracked but still smoldering, beat like a sleeping heart. The survivors did not notice the sound at first. A low rumble across the horizon, steel on stone, the rhythmic stomp of boots and the creak of wheels. It grew louder, accompanied by the faint echo of dwarfen voices, harsh and clipped, their language like hammers striking anvil. Then came the silhouettes. Marching out of the shimmering heat mirage, a column of dwarfen engineers and riflemen, their armor glinting in the morning sun, axes at their belts, black powder rifles slung over their backs. Steam tanks lumbered behind them, chuffing smoke into the air, flanked by mule-pulled wagons and auto-carriages bearing the hammer sigil of Nehekhara. At their head marched a stout, grim-faced dwarf with a gold monocle and a beard braided with cogs and bullet casings. He stopped atop a dune and raised a spyglass. His eye widened. "By Grungni's hammer," he muttered. "Get the medici?" "Now." They were lifted gently, carefully, placed into stretchers and examined with reverence and urgency. The dwarfs, for all their gruffness, handled them as one might ancient relics, fragile yet powerful. Frida clutched her journal to her chest even as medics wrapped her hands. Klausner resisted sedation until they let him mutter a prayer to his god one last time. The soldiers wept openly as they were given water that didn't taste of rot and metal. The lead dwarf sat beside Frida as she lay beneath a tarp wrapped in a warm blanket. His name was Thalgrim Ironbrow, expedition captain of the Iron Route Reclamation Corps. "You'll make it," he said. "We've got you now. Whatever the hell happened here, it's over." Frida opened one eye. "No," she rasped. "It's sleeping." He frowned, confused. She closed her eyes again. In the east, the wind carried the last echoes of war, shrieks on the wind that faded into silence. The dunes shifted once more, concealing the black stone beneath another layer of sand. The pulse of the buried shard slowed. But Nehekhara forgets nothing. And the dead are very, very patient.